Yo, what's going on? Hope you're doing well. Today is a very exciting day. We're going to be building up my new Ibis HD6. I've been without a trail bike for a few months now, so to be building up a freshie gets me super amped. For today's video, I'm going to be taking you through all of the details of the build, talking about my processes as a mechanic, and I hope you can pick up a few things that may help you on your next bike build. So let's get into it. So before we actually start putting parts on this beautiful frame here, I just wanted to talk about a few things that I was really impressed by as soon as I pulled this HD6 out of the box. The first thing is this rear shock mount. For one, this is a nice sturdy bolt, which is great, but more importantly, the rear shock that came stock on this bike, which I've taken off, came stock with a metal rear bushing. Now, in my experience, the bikes I was riding last year have a similar shock layout, not suspension design, but the shock is in the same position. And I had a lot of issues with the DU bushings developing play and in some cases even cracking. So halfway through last season, I switched to metal bushings on the rear mount and it fixed all of my issues. So to see Ibis be doing this straight from the factory was really impressive for me. Additionally, I was really impressed by their attention to detail with this extra bit of frame protection for tire rub. I actually haven't put a wheel in this thing yet, but I'm assuming that that is right in the correct spot for that. I mean, of course, if you're running a wide tire over time, that's going to peel off, but the attention to detail is there, and I'm just very impressed. You know, with these two little things combined, it's very obvious that Ibis know what they're doing. Another aspect of this bike that I was really impressed by from the get-go is this chain guide integration. If you notice on the drive side shell of the BB, and also we should note threaded BB, which is great to see. You can see that this, I'm not doing this lefty, so this isn't gonna work so well. There it goes. But yeah, that clicks into place. Obviously you need to make sure you have the orientation right. But you can see the teeth line up. And anyways, I just thought that that was a really clever way to integrate the chain guide. And lastly, this is a 200mm dropper post. I haven't linked it up with a cable yet, but in terms of the clearance, it did just drop straight down through the bottom of the frame all fine. I'm sure it's gonna have to poke up a little bit once I toss a cable in there, but it is really awesome to see that this frame seems to fit longer dropper posts really well. This is the S2 for reference, so obviously that will, change by size, but for the S2, which I think has a 454mm reach, if I remember off the top of my head correctly, for that to fit a 200mm dropper really well is super impressive. I should also note that this bike was sent to me for free from Ibis. However, I am not directly partnered with the brand, but a huge thank you to them for sending this thing out. I'm really excited to be riding it, and all the things I'll be mentioning about the bike are just my own opinion. I'd never go and trash a bike. I think most bikes are pretty rad these days. But those details I just mentioned were a few things that really jumped out at me, as soon as I pulled this thing out of the box, and were just a few details that I thought I needed to shout out because they did a really great job on them. Last thing to note before we start putting some parts on this frame is today is March 29th. This video should be coming out in about 2 weeks once the embargo is lifted on this fork, which is the new Marzo Super Z. This is a prototype version of it that I've had for a second now. Cannot wait to try this thing out, 38mm stanchions. And then we've also got the new turbine bar from RaceFace. Really amped on this. I've always ran the turbine bar for most of last year, and the other older bar was great, so the new one's going to be even better. So psyched on that. And we've got a plethora of other RaceFace, Maxxis, and Shimano parts to go on this thing. First things first, here's the headset we're going to be running. It's a Cane Creek 40. Not endorsed by Cane Creek in any way, shape, or form. Never have been, but I always buy these things. I think it's a good balance between price and quality. I think this was 75 bucks for both cups, if I'm not mistaken. I've been running these on my bikes for probably the last 2 or 3 seasons and never really had a major problem, so let's get this tossed in. So whenever I'm doing a headset, I always grease both the frame and the cups individually before pressing them in. So we're gonna grab the bearing press and toss the bottom cup in first now. One little thing I like to do is on these Cane Creek 40s, you can see the Cane Creek, and it's just kind of a nice little pro thing to make sure that that is centered like toward the head badge of the frame. No one is absolutely ever going to notice that, but it's the little things like that that I think really bring a bike together. So there you can see the Cane Creek lined up with the Ibis head badge, and we'll go ahead and press that thing in now. Making sure it's going in nice and straight. Headset cups went in nice and smoothly, and now we're gonna head on to the fork. I'm running a 40 mil rise bar on this bike, which is actually a new offering from RaceFace. Previously, they maxed out at 35 mil rise, and because of this bar height, I'm not going to be running quite as much stack as I usually do. I think I'm gonna toss the crown race on the fork and sort of play around and see sort of what looks right, and just use my best eye judgment on where I should cut this fork. Boom. Got the orange to go with the orange frame. Gonna be looking nice. Running the 40 mil stem on this bike. There it is. So this is the new turbine handlebar. So stoked on this. They come now size specific, which is amazing. So this is the 780 millimeter width, and it is intended to be cut down only to 760. So 20 mil increment. They also make larger sizes of this handlebar as well. The whole purpose of this is that way you're getting the adequate flex characteristic. I personally learned a ton about handlebar flex last year. I was trying some carbon bars, some aluminum bars, and just trying to find which one I had the most ideal compliance with. At the end of the day, I was running the old turbine handlebar in a 35 mil rise by 780 mil width, which was cut down from 820, I believe. So this new bar has an improved flex characteristic at my 780 millimeter width because it is built for this specific size. So I absolutely cannot wait to ride this thing, and I'm so stoked to put it on this new bike. And then when I do the crown races on these forks, I also like to toss some grease on here as well, just to prevent any creaking in the future. So now we're gonna loosely put everything together. In the past, I don't have any of my old bikes here anymore, but I think in general I was doing a double like this on top of the Cane Creek top cap. So I was gonna maybe go lower, but I'll maybe start there and just see what's up. And I'm gonna toss this bar loosely on the stem just to help with the visualization of everything. Okay, grab the silver Sharpie just to mark the steer tube. Let's do this. Okay, and bar stem. All right, how's that looking? So after first impressions, I'm actually liking the way that the two taller spacers combined looks. I think I kind of overlooked how short this head tube is, which I don't think is inherently a bad thing. However, it is shorter than the bikes I would ride in the past. So I think running the same amount of spacers is a good concept, even though I do have the higher rise bar. In the future, if I ever want to go lower with this, I can drop a spacer and cut the fork. Or I can go to a lower rise handlebar. So I think I'm actually gonna run it at this height. I'll mark here, cut it, and then we'll just do an additional just thin spacer to give the stem a little bit of space, and yeah, bolt all this stuff together. Silver Sharpie is nice to have on deck for this job. So that's marked. Obviously, it's not the finest marking, so I just cut it on the inside of that line. I'm a big fan of using the pipe cutter to cut forks. There we have it. Now with the fork trimmed up to size, I like to use this rigid deburring tool. It's an old trusty, always lives in the toolbox. Perfect, every time. Sort of on the same tone as lining up the Cane Creek lower headset cup logo with the head tube logo, I also really like to use RaceFace headset spacers on all of my builds. I'm obviously super spoiled to ride for RaceFace and do things like this, but it's just another one of those little things that gives the build some extra personality and takes it to the next level, in my opinion. So there we have it, all bolted up, looking nice. Definitely looking pretty tall, but that head tube ain't so tall. So I think it should feel all right. And then we have the high rise bar. I think I'm gonna start high and lower things if needed after the first ride or two. Really stoked on how all the stem spacers look. We've got the eyes lined up there, and then on the front, we've got it lined up with the RaceFace logos. Again, the Cane Creek logo, turbine logos looking good. Everything's looking mint. We've just got the top cap with one more thin spacer there just for some extra wiggle room, and everything is tidy just how I like it. Fork install went super smooth, really amped on all of the parts we're running with the Super Z, the new turbine bar, and that orange turbine stem. Some really good stuff up there. So gonna toss the GoPro back on and let's toss this rear shock in. Gonna be running the Bomber Air from Marzo on this thing. Lots of experience on this shock and it is dope. Should be looking pretty nice. I was told if I want to, I can make some custom decals. I'm pretty into vinyl cutting, so I might do that. Maybe we could do like an orange to match the frame or something. But to start off, we're gonna take off this rear bushing and toss in the metal bushing. A little bit of grease on the outside of this. Boom. And these metal bushings can be pretty difficult to actually get in here. Gonna try this for this round. I recently picked up that vise, so I wanted to try it out for the pressing of this metal bushing, but didn't really dig it too much when I got to the end. So just finishing the last little bit of the install with the old trusty DU bushing press from Abbey Tools here. And there we have it, nice and smooth. Now let's toss in some of this hardware. This hardware came out of the shock super easy, so it should just slide right in. So there we go. We've got the rear bushing switched over to a metal bushing. We have the hardware in. Now the last thing we're gonna do is depressurize the shock and rotate this rear eyelet 90 degrees and then put it into the bike. I'm pretty sure you have to do this. I'm not totally sure. I do it every time just to be safe. There's 90 PSI in this shock stock, so I'll just toss it back to 90 afterwards so it's got some length and then equalize the chambers before actually setting up my suspension later on in the setup process. Boom. And that should be about 90 degrees. So let's do it. Rear shock is now in, and I gotta say, now that it's in there, I'm definitely digging the red logo actually, so I might end up leaving that. Everything went fairly smoothly after a bit of finicking with the bolts, as what typically happens with a rear shock. I did notice one other thing that I wanted to give a shout out to for Ibis for doing. I don't know if you can see it quite on camera, but there's some extra clear vinyl protection up there for when you're installing a rear shock, or I guess in case something crazy went wrong and the reservoir hits there, there's a little bit of an extra clear tape, which I thought was nice. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier is that there is a shuttle protection pad there. So lots of good little details on this frame, and I'm very impressed. So far, so smooth with this build, and an exciting package actually just showed up at the doorstep, which is this box from my friends over at Tidal. Big shout out to my homie Ben over there. That is the seat for this bike, and that was the last part that needed to show up. All right, so let's get all prepped to run some cables through this frame. First thing I want to note is that this bike did not come with any rubber grommets to reduce cable rattle where the cables enter and exit the frame. My old YTs always had them, and I thought it was a really nice touch. So we're gonna use some electrical shrink wrap to accomplish the same exact thing. I'm just gonna mark on each cable with a gold Sharpie where it needs some extra protection, then use the heat gun and install some of this. And that's kind of the only real neat thing we're gonna be doing here. Everything else is straightforward. I'll probably just rip through this because it's a bit of a tedious process, nothing too glamorous. So let's get it done. Really big fan of these new RaceFace Chester grips. I was running prototype versions of these grips on a few of my bikes all of last season and had a really great time. These new ones are an even better rubber compound, which is great, and they come in two sizes, small and large. Generally, I prefer a larger grip. I'm gonna run small for a bit. I have an extra pair of the large ones that I can run on this bike if I want. And I actually have the large ones on my downhill bike, but we'll try out these small 31 mils to start things off on this new bike. Orange clamps too, nice little touch. Thanks to the guys at RaceFace for that. So on this bike, we're gonna be running the XTR 10 to 51 long cage derailleur, shifter, and cassette. My reasoning for this is that I definitely like having that bigger gear in the back for some of the trails that I've been riding recently, which have some pretty aggressive climbs. In the past, I've ran the 10 to 45 setup and I really enjoy that. It definitely leads to a slightly quieter bike and just everything's a little bit more tidy. However, for practicality, we're going with the easier setup on this bike moving forward. All right, let's start with tossing this derailleur on here. Now we're gonna go ahead and link up all of the iSpec stuff to these brakes. This is the front brake lever, so we're gonna toss on the dropper post lever as well. There we go. Front brake side all wrapped up. And there is the back brake side all wrapped up. It's important when you're doing your cables to get them all nice and neat, to put your levers pretty close to where you want them. So I'm just kind of feeling out here about where I want the lever just before I start marking and cutting the cables. Oh. Kind of what I look for when doing the rear derailleur length up here is for just a clean match to the rear brake line, and then I'll attach these with some clips, which I think I have, or I'll use some small zip ties or something, but I definitely try to keep those at about the same angle, just keeps things looking nice and tidy. Great progress has been made so far, and now we're gonna do a bit of a modification on my brakes. I do this to reduce the noise from the Shimano finned pads. I really enjoy running the fin pads for temperature regulation. However, they can rattle a bit, and this will fix that. So this is a product called mastic tape from 3M, and what we're gonna do is just toss a little bit on these rims, which is where the finned pads come in contact with the caliper and make some noise. And yeah, there you have it. So super simple, quick thing to do. In addition to this, you can also stretch out the spring that helps set the pads in place. You can stretch that out a little bit, which helps as well, but this does most of the work for you. So this is what it looks like when you're all done. You can barely tell that extra rubber is in there. I also stretched the springs out a little bit just to get this as quiet as possible, but it's a good little upgrade if you're running the Shimano brakes with the finned pads. I'm gonna go ahead and do this on the front brake now, and then we'll move on to putting the bottom bracket in. Here is the crank and bottom bracket situation. We are running the XTR cranks in a 170 mil length and a XTR threaded BB. Gonna go with a 32 tooth chainring and toss this thing in. I haven't done a threaded bottom bracket in a while, so that's exciting. And I've also never installed a pair of cranks on this bike, so I don't really know what the spacing is gonna end up being like in terms of, you know, how many bottom bracket spacers I need. And I've not really played around with this chain guide thing yet. So there's a lot of room for some mistakes that are about to go down right now, but hopefully this goes as smoothly as possible. So we've got some crank spacers that we can do on the spindle afterwards. So I think I'm gonna bank on that and just install the BB with no spacers and see where we end up. So that's only finger tight, but I'm gonna toss these through and just see kind of roughly where we're at. Whoa, so with no spacer, the chainring actually hits right there. So because a spacer is going to be mandatory, I'm going to toss out this shell and space out on that side, just a hair. Almost think I should use 2 because that was hitting pretty savage. Been too long since I've done a threaded BB. I don't remember which tool it is. Shoot, I might not even have the right tool. This might be awkward. Okay, so I'll do 1 spacer and then the chain guide. So we've now got the chain guide adapter, 1 spacer, and then that drive side shell on. We're gonna do another test fit. So let's see what we're working with. Okay, that's adequate clearance there between the sprocket and the frame, so that's good. To be completely honest with you, I don't actually know if this is going to be the perfect chain line. I'm not super experienced with that kind of stuff, but I would say that this looks about good to me. I don't think with a chain on there it's going to hit, but I kind of want to check. I'd say that's probably perfect. Like I said, not an expert at that kind of thing, but that's looking pretty solid to me there. So yeah, and then yeah, other side's looking solid too. So I think let's toss on the chain guide and get that test fit and go from there. Boom. Yeah, that's perfectly centered. Sweet. So it turned out I didn't even have the right tool for this. I'm not sure how that happened. I have about every other bottom bracket option, but I guess not that one. So what I ended up having to do, which is super sketchy and I wouldn't recommend it, is you toss a rag around it and then use a pair of vice grips. It still dings the outside of the shell a little, but you can get away with this. I've done it a few times. Like I said, I would not recommend it, but hey, I'm a home mechanic. We're keeping it real out here, and this is what I had to do. So oh shit. This is looking like a 29er. Well, everything was going smoothly until I realized that unfortunately I was sent 2 29er wheels instead of a mullet setup. So we're on standstill and we're gonna pick back up once the appropriate wheel arrives. All right, and after a little bit of a build hiatus there, the correct back wheel has arrived and we are ready to wrap this thing up. Off camera, I just tossed some Saint clipless pedals on there. I run it with all the pins on both sides and just toss the front wheel on. So we're gonna mount up this back tire, toss a rotor on, just dial in the drivetrain, and we are going to be all done. Whenever I'm lacing up a fresh set of tires on some wheels, I always make sure on the drive side that the valve stem is right in between the X's on the Maxxis, kind of like the King Creek headset. It's not necessary, but some extra steez points for sure. There you have it. That one took a couple more PSI than normal. And I like to just give it a couple tosses. Do a few of these as well. So whenever you're using a drill to install your rotor bolts, I do two things. I start the threads by just hand, just so you're not cross-threading anything. And then as well, this may be common knowledge, but thought it'd be worth mentioning. If your drill has settings, so it's not just, if you can see there in drill mode, if you can back it off to where it will actually stop, kind of like a torque spec, I typically like to back it off just a little bit. Don't leave it in the drill setting, because if you're going in and then the bolt stops, it'll torque it, and the metal on rotor bolts is typically fairly soft and it's really easy to strip them out. So just a good little tidbit of knowledge there in case you didn't already know that. Those are all started off. Then there you can see the drill cut out just like that. Boom. And then just grab your T25, this guy, and just do the final torque by hand here. All right, time for the cassette. Look at that, beauty. Bing, bang, boom, back wheel is together. We got the rotor on, the cassette on. So we have two more steps before we can put this on the bike. The first is we're gonna give this new rotor a wipe down with 99% rubbing alcohol. I do that on all new rotors. Just in case, another thing is you do not want to use brake clean like you would use on a vehicle. 99% alcohol is better for bicycles. And then we're gonna lube up that back axle, toss this together, cut the chain, and we're gonna be all wrapped up. Let's go. Toss a solid line of grease on this back axle here. There we go. Alrighty, so all the parts are on the bike and all that's left to do is set up the shifting, set sag on suspension, do a bleed on the brakes, and a bit of a bolt check all around. I spend a lot of time doing all of those things. It's a tedious process for me, so I'm not gonna show that, but I will check back in once all that is done and we'll just do a brief overview of the whole bike and wrap up the video. Boom, there we have it. So hyped on this thing. Just wrapped up the shifting, bleeding the brakes, setting up the cockpit, suspension, few other minor little details, but damn, is this thing looking so nice. We've got the new turbine, aluminum bar, the new Super Z fork. I cannot wait to test this thing out. And of course, the HD6 frame. Major shouts out to the team over at Ibis for sending this over. I cannot wait to start riding this thing. Next up from this bike will be a first ride and impressions video. I'm really looking forward to getting this bike out on the trail, playing around with some of the suspension, especially the new Super Z fork now that it's got the Grip X damper with the high and low speed compression. Really looking forward to playing with that, as well as just getting used to a new bike. Lots of really good things to look forward to. And then once I have this thing dialed in, a few weeks down the road, there will be a full in-depth bike check. So lots of good stuff to come. Thank you so much for watching this week's video. I really appreciate the support and we'll catch you next time. Peace.